He is going to uproot the U.S. Constitution and rewrite it in his own image. Rick Perry going out there with some big plans. We know this is a guy that is suffering right now. Beyond the oops, he just really hasn't found traction among GOP voters. What do you guys make of this newest plan? Is it a Hail Mary pass to save his candidacy?
You know, it's laughable in some ways because, I think Rick Perry is a more serious guy than he's come across over the last several weeks. At least I hope he is. But if you think about where he started, and this is not a partisan comment, he originally, a few years back, and this would offend the great veteran at the table, he wanted to secede from the Union. Suggested that was one way they could avoid following federal law. We obviously have chronicled his mistakes during the campaign. But to say you want to uproot the federal government, I know we're discussed around the country, Congress is in action, but the way you deal with that is you change the personnel and you change the leadership. I think people probably don't take him as seriously as he'd like, and there's no doubt this is an effort to appeal, I think, to a very conservative base who dislikes government and may dislike President Obama and Nancy Pelosi, but this isn't a serious proposal. I don't think independents will interpret it that way.
And let's look at what is a few elements of Rick Perry's grand master strategy. He wants to cut congressional pay, budget, and their time in D.C. by half. And the biggest one for me was end lifetime tenure for federal judges. He wants to make the Supreme Court not a lifetime position, a Supreme Court bench position, not lifetime, but an 18-year position, which would involve changing the U.S. Constitution, as far as I can tell.
It's interesting because you see what Rick Perry's trying to do. I mean, he's playing to the fact that Congress right now has about a 13% approval rating amongst the country. So he's playing to this idea, well, they don't work hard enough, we should be giving them part-time because they're basically only doing part-time work. So I understand what he's trying to do politically. The challenge of it is this. When you look at the things that he is proposing, whether it be eliminating agencies within the federal government.
Do you know the three he wants to eliminate?
Yeah. And I would actually love to hear his argument.
What are they, Wes?
Well, I would love to hear how he thinks departments like Commerce and departments like Education have done nothing to help the United States government, or the United States, over the past, 2 decades. I'd love to hear his argument towards that. But more importantly than that, you have to look at it this way. Instead of focusing on things that, quite honestly, aren't just Hail Marys, but are unconstitutional in terms of what he's trying to propose, what about talking about issues that, as the Commander-in-Chief and as the President of the United States, you actually do have authority over? We have yet to hear him talk about Afghanistan with any real substance. We have yet to hear him talk about how a repeal of the health care law would actually help the most vulnerable who will be hurt by this. So that's what I would love to hear him talk about, instead of things like that he has absolutely zero control over.
Well, you act like he's running for president, not the Republican nomination. I mean, it's very clear that they got people into a focus group. They talked about the fact that the most appealing thing about Perry is the fact that he's a Washington outsider, and this is a proposal that is meant to drive that image home, right? So this isn't about policies, because he can't win on policies. What he can win on, if anything, is framing himself as the one person who's outside of the fray.
Well, I think he can win on policies, and that's because the job growth rate in Texas is extraordinary, and it's basically due to his
most
policies.
of those went to undocumented immigrants.
I think, well, he's going to have a problem with that. We can talk about in-state tuition for illegals. I'm going to use the word because it's true, they're illegal.
Go ahead. You're not running for president.
I'm not running for president, and there is a big distinction between that. But I think he is making a good point about Washington outsiders and wanting these people who are accountable to us to go back to their districts and be accountable to the people who will. I think a lot of times when people get entrenched in the Washington machine, they do lose touch with their voters. They do lose touch with the reasons why they're standing for what they're standing for. And I don't think he was saying, well, let's just throw the Constitution out. I'm going to go in and uproot everything. I think he understands some of these things will require a constitutional amendment. But he's saying, I want to change the system. I want to change the way Washington works. So I didn't take him literally, but more figuratively to mean, let's go in there and let's shake things up.
But I just think it's so naive. Oh, Congress should spend less time in Washington. If you read the account of what's wrong with Congress right now, people aren't spending time reading bills. There is a lack of institutional knowledge among those who are serving. The idea that they'd be better served by being away from the infrastructure and not debating ideas and not discussing and not coming to bipartisan compromise, I think is again just a wildly naive of how the way government works.
I actually took it more as an interpretation toward promoting term limits. That's how I understood it. Now, obviously, if you're going to have some type of term limit for Supreme Court justices, that requires a constitutional amendment. Maybe we can have a discussion about that on a larger scale. But I think term limits are essential in terms of holding them accountable, because these people, it becomes you do for me, I do for you, and they lose touch with why they're there. They work for us, not the other way around.
There's states that have term limits, and we can look at how those states have behaved politically, how those states have conducted political debates and the outcomes. I don't think you would find any better outcomes in states with term limits versus those without. And if term limits are his goal, we should have that conversation. But at the end of the day, none of what he's talking about, I think, will impact anything that the country is most focused on, from jobs, from debt, from even other issues that have been raised here. I would agree with you, Jed. He has a great job creating record, but he has been unable to forcefully, clearly, concisely, convincingly talk about what he did and how he could translate that into job creation at the federal level. I'd love to hear him talk about it. As an American, even as a Democrat, I'd love to know what did he do, how did he do it, and how would he plan to do that at the federal level. Throughout his time in the campaign, he's done more, he's fumbled the ball more than he's advanced the field. And he has evidently has a great history there in Texas of doing positive things. It'd be good to hear them. The only thing we've heard is HPV. We've heard the immigration issue. And again, I actually think he's more right on immigration than perhaps you do, and maybe even some others do. But
that's one of my beef with him.
I'd love to hear him talk about jobs.
Yeah, I would too.
Well, and instead of being sort of distracted by these
urgent things you don't know what he's talking about.
Tax forms on postcards, and effectively a strategy for the government that one expert has called a visit to Wonderland. I mean, he's down the rabbit hole on this.
But Alex, at least that was I mean, the idea of having a simple tax form, I actually like the idea. I'd love to hear more details about that than suggesting that, to your point, the problem with Congress having served here is not that we spent too much time there, is that we didn't spend enough getting to know one another, didn't spend enough trying to foster agreement or find agreement on big issues. So I'd love to hear him talk about his postcard more than term limits on Supreme Court justices. I didn't know that was a big issue in the country. Maybe
Rewriting the Constitution aside, we will have more to discuss.